The first atomic bomb was not born in a flash of lightning or a surge of divine inspiration. It was forged in the bowels of a remote New Mexico desert, where 3,500 scientists and engineers worked in absolute secrecy, their fingers hovering over keyboards that would determine the fate of civilization. On July 16, 1945, as the sun rose over what was then called the Project Alberta site, a 10-ton steel and concrete containment vessel stood ready, its contents invisible to the naked eye but capable of unleashing destruction on a scale never before witnessed. The world held its breath as physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer murmured the words that would echo through history. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The mushroom cloud that erupted that morning would grow to stand 3 times the height of the Empire State Building, its presence visible for 100 miles across the New Mexico desert. Yet this was merely the beginning of a story that would reshape human history forever. The Manhattan Project represented the largest scientific endeavor in human history, consuming more than $2 billion at the time, equivalent to over $30 billion today, and employing over 100,000 people across 3 secret sites stretching from Ottawa, Illinois to Los Alamos, New Mexico. But before the smoke cleared over the New Mexico desert, before the mushroom cloud painted the sky in hues of almanac and gold, there was a race. A race not against time alone, but against the very forces of destruction that had already claimed millions of lives across 2 world wars. The story begins not in America, but in a patent office in Bern, Switzerland, where a quiet patent clerk named Albert Einstein scribbled equations on yellowed paper that would change the course of human history. It was 1939, and the world was already trembling on the edge of catastrophe. Adolf Hitler's SS had begun their systematic campaign against Europe's Jews, and the blitzkrieg tactics of the German Wehrmacht had reduced Poland to rubble in a matter of weeks. But Einstein's calculations revealed something far more terrifying than the tanks rolling through Warsaw or the dive bombers shattering London's streets. His letter to President Roosevelt, signed on August 2, 1939, warned that nuclear fission could release enormous energy, potentially creating weapons of unimaginable destructive power. Einstein's letter reached Roosevelt at the White House just as the fall of Paris unfolded before America's eyes. The French had fallen in just 43 days, and the Wehrmacht was now pounding against the Maginot Line, preparing to breach the defensive, but he had no experience building weapons, no military training, and certainly no track record of managing thousands of people. Yet his mind worked differently from other scientists. Where others saw equations, Oppenheimer saw possibilities. Where others saw risk, he saw solutions. And where others saw failure, he saw the edge of breakthrough. The decision to locate the project's primary facility in Los Alamos, New Mexico, was made almost arbitrarily. The Los Alamos Ranch House, a dilapidated hunting lodge nestled in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, was chosen largely because it was remote, accessible only by a single dirt road that wound through the mountains like a thread through a needle. When the first workers arrived in March 1943, they found themselves in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by ponderosa pines and the howling wind that swept down from the Sangre de Cristo range. The ranch house itself was unsuitable for the massive undertaking that lay ahead. Within weeks, construction crews arrived, followed by architects, engineers, and workmen who would transform the high desert into something resembling a small city. By the time Oppenheimer arrived at Los Alamos on April 24, 1943, the facility was still a work in progress. Temporary buildings sprouted across the landscape like plastic flowers, their windows boarded up against the winter wind that howled through the mountain passes. The laboratory would eventually house over 6,000 scientists and support staff, but in those early days, the population was much smaller. A skeleton crew of essential personnel trying to establish the foundations for what would become the most ambitious scientific project in human history. Oppenheimer's first task was assembling a team capable of solving the unsolvable. He needed men who understood nuclear physics, chemistry, metallurgy, ordnance, and engineering. More importantly, he needed them to work in complete secrecy, with no knowledge of the project's true scope or ultimate purpose. The secrecy was absolute. Workers lived in dormitories and trailer parks, their families arriving separately under strict anonymity agreements. The post office was non-existent, mail was handled through encrypted channels, and visitors were forbidden. Even the local Native American pueblo, which had inhabited the area for centuries, was kept in the dark about the massive construction project transforming their ancestral lands. The only hint of what was coming came in the form of supply trucks that began arriving from across the country, carrying everything from precision instruments to construction materials to food so elaborate that some workers jokingly referred to it as gourmet warfare. As Los Alamos grew, so did the complexity of the challenge ahead. The atomic bomb required not just scientific brilliance but industrial might on a scale that dwarfed anything seen during the war. The project needed uranium enriched to percentages that had never been achieved before, plutonium produced in reactors that barely existed on paper, and conventional explosives manufactured in quantities that strained the entire American industrial base. The race was on, not just against time, but against the laws of physics themselves. Every equation presented new obstacles, every experiment revealed unexpected complications, and every breakthrough raised new questions about the very nature of the weapon they were creating. The urgency intensified in July 1945, when intelligence reports confirmed that Germany's own atomic research program, though hampered by wartime shortages and scientific brain drain, still posed a credible threat. The German nuclear program, centered around the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Physics in Berlin, had attracted some of Europe's finest scientific minds. While they lacked the industrial resources of the American effort, they possessed knowledge that could prove decisive if the war lasted longer than expected. The race was no longer theoretical. It had become a matter of life and death for the entire civilized world. In the Pacific theater, the stakes grew even higher. The war with Japan had entered its final, bloodiest phase. The capture of Saipan had brought B-29 superfortresses within striking distance of the Japanese home islands, and the massive casualties incurred during the battle for Okinawa suggested that an invasion of the homeland would cost millions of American lives. The question that haunted the War Department was simple: could the atomic bomb end the war without an invasion? Or would the development of such a weapon merely prolong the conflict, leading to a nuclear arms race that could destabilize the entire post-war world? These were the questions that kept General Groves awake at night, that made Oppenheimer pace the labs at Los Alamos, that sent shivers down the spines of scientists who had never imagined they would play a role in creating the most destructive weapon ever devised. The Trinity test would prove that the bomb worked, but what it would unleash upon the world remained unknown. As the countdown clock ticked towards zero on that sweltering July morning in New Mexico, the entire future of humanity hung in the balance, balanced on the edge of a steel sphere that contained the dreams, fears, and calculations of the greatest minds of their generation. The tension in the war room that evening was palpable, as General Groves stood at the head of the long, polished table, his hands clasped tightly around a stack of maps and technical sheets. Before him spread a vivid map of Europe, marked with red circles and blue markers, each one representing a secret experiment, a classified project, or a desperate hope. The room buzzed with quiet urgency, the weight of what might come next pressing down on every face. Close at hand, a young scientist named Klaus Fuchs had just delivered a coded message, his presence hinting at the shadowy network of spies that would soon turn history on its head. Outside the reinforced window, the scorching summer sun broke through the dust that rose from the moldering streets of Berlin, a stark contrast to the cold, controlled corridors within. Inside, the air was thick with significance, each breath carrying the weight of decisions that would shape the future of the world. The drums of the laboratory would soon echo with the sound of explosions, not just from bombs, but from the minds racing to outpace one another in a desperate bid for supremacy. The scientists at Los Alamos had already begun work on the second bomb. Known as the Gadget, it was a plutonium implosion device, its design a race against time and uncertainty. Unlike the uranium-based Little Boy, which relied on a simple gun-type mechanism, the Fat Man required split-second precision. Enrico Fermi gathered in the control room, his fingers trembling as he tested the criticality of fissile material in the laboratory's the 8 laboratory. A single miscalculation could trigger a chain reaction, turning the desert into a crater. Meanwhile, the Manhattan Project's clandestine nature bred paranoia. General Leslie Groves, its director, authorized wiretaps on phones, monitored visitors, and even subjected personnel to lie detector tests. Yet the most insidious threat came from somewhere unexpected. In the UK, physicist Klaus Fuchs had grown increasingly restless. A double agent for the Soviet Union, Fuchs had fed critical data to Moscow since 1942, including details about plutonium's potential as a fuel. His access to Britain's Tube Alloys project and subsequent transfer to Los Alamos in 1944 gave the Soviets a roadmap to their own bomb. The Cambridge Five, espionage ring led by Kim Philby, had infiltrated British intelligence, but it was Fuchs's technical expertise that made him the crown jewel of Soviet nuclear ambitions. When the war ended, Fuchs's arrest in 1950 revealed the extent of the breach. Soviet scientists like Georgy Flyarov, who oversaw the USSR's first atomic test, had relied on Fuchs's flawed but vital information. "He gave us the key," Flyarov later admitted. Without Fuchs's leaks, The Soviet program might have stalled for years, but the Manhattan Project's secrecy extended beyond its scientists. In Oak Ridge, Tennessee, a city of 75,000 built from scratch, workers toiled under the strictest security. The facility's 9-mile-long chain-link fence and 24-hour surveillance left no room for curiosity. Inside, physicist Richard Oppenheimer directed the colute typically, but even he had no idea what the plant was really producing. The city's cafeteria menus listed special chemical weapons research as its purpose, and rumors of the bomb swirled among the workers. Meanwhile, in Chicago, the metallurgical laboratory under physicist Enrico Fermi was experimenting with early reactor designs. Their Reactor 40, a towering pile of uranium and graphite, achieved the first sustained nuclear chain reaction on December 2, 1942, a milestone that proved fission could be controlled. Yet the Manhattan Project's leaders knew this was only a beginning. The race to deploy Little Boy and Fat Man accelerated as August 1945 approached. At the Potsdam Conference, Truman informed Stalin that the U.S. had a new weapon of unusual destructive force. Stalin, already aware through Fuchs's spies, offered a cryptic smile. Back in New Mexico, the Trinity test's success was followed by urgent preparations for deployment. Little Boy was loaded onto the Enola Gay, a B-29 bomber equipped with a revolutionary new armament system. The Enola Gay's crew, led by Colonel Paul Tibbets, trained in secret at Roswell Army Airfield, practicing low-level bombing runs to evade Japanese radar. Japan's Prime Minister, Kantaro Suzuki, dismissed Truman's warning as a stalling tactic, but the military knew invasion plans were already underway. Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan, would require 500,000 U.S. troops to assault Kyushu shores by November 1945, with a second wave targeting Honshu a month later. Estimates suggested over 1 million Allied casualties, and countless Japanese lives lost in the resistance. The human cost of the bomb's development weighed heavily on its architects. J. Robert Oppenheimer, the project's scientific director, later called the Trinity test a moment of unambiguous achievement, but also the beginning of an atomic age that would terrify humanity. His colleague, Vannevar Bush, warned that nuclear weapons could unravel the social fabric of the world, while General Groves privately feared the precedent such a weapon would set. Yet the alternatives were grim. The Soviet Union's Red Army advanced across Europe, and Stalin had vowed to carve a sphere of influence, stretching from Berlin to the Pacific. Without a decisive end to the war, the U.S. risked a drawn-out conflict that might have bled into a nuclear arms race within a decade. As the Enola Gay prepared for its mission, the crew faced their own moral reckoning. First Lieutenant Theodore Van Kirk, the bombardier, recalled the heavy silence on board as they approached Tinian Island for fuel. The crew's motivations were as tangled as the mission itself. Tibbets had volunteered for the project, driven by a desire to finish the war quickly. Van Kirk, a Wisconsin native, had prayed nightly for guidance. Meanwhile, Captain Marcel Ferrier, the Enola Gay's weatherman, calculated that the bomb would drop over Kokura if clouds obscured Hiroshima. "We knew what it was," Ferrier would later say. "We knew it was going to kill a lot of people. We didn't know how many." The decision to target Hiroshima became a political and military calculation. The War Department had compiled a list of cities vulnerable to nuclear attack, prioritizing those with military significance and industrial capacity. Kyoto, Hiroshima, Yokohama, and Kokura were the primary candidates. When Secretary of War Henry Stimson insisted Kyoto be spared for its cultural heritage, Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal overruled him, declaring, "We've got to pick a place that's important to Japan and not a bunch of civilians." Even General Arnold, the Army Air Force's chief, opposed using the bomb on a city, arguing it would make the whole world sick of the U.S. Yet Hiroshima's Mitsubishi factory, which produced torpedoes and fighter planes, made it a legitimate target in military terms. For the Japanese, the war had already become a siege. By July 1945, the U.S. Navy's submarine campaign had cut off 90% of Japan's food supply, and B-29 raids had burned out 40% of its cities. Emperor Hirohito and Prime Minister Suzuki faced mounting pressure to surrender, but the military high command refused to capitulate without guarantees of imperial continuity. The Imperial Household Declaration of July 26, the Potsdam Ultimatum, demanded unconditional surrender, but the military high command dismissed it as a stalling tactic. On July 28, Japanese newspapers warned that the war must be fought to the last man, even as American bombers reduced Japan's cities to ash. When the Enola Gay reached its launch point over Tinian on August 6, 1945, General Groves watched the takeoff with a mix of pride and dread. Aboard the plane, Hiroshima lay within the crosshairs. The bomb's little man core weighed over 9,000 pounds, housing 64 kilograms of highly enriched uranium-235. As the Enola Gay turned toward its target, a translucent spherical bomb hung beneath its wings, its surface gleaming under the Japanese sun. At 8:15 a.m., the bomb's little boy detonated 1,900 feet above the city, unleashing energy equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT. The blast, flash, and shockwave merged in an instant, vaporizing everything within a 1.6-mile radius. At Ground Zero, survivors described the heat as a flash brighter than daylight, followed by a gust of wind that shattered windows and hurled people like debris. Within seconds, the devastation was complete. The bomb's physics were as brutal as its effects. Neutrons bombarded the uranium core, triggering fission and releasing gamma rays, X-rays, and fast-moving electrons. In Hiroshima, the initial fireball reached temperatures of 100 million degrees Celsius, searing skin to charcoal. The shockwave flattened buildings up to 3 miles away, while the blast overpressure, measured at 3.2 pounds per square inch at Ground Zero, collapsed structures and shattered eardrums. The explosion's thermal pulse ignited firestorms that burned for 3 days, with victims trapped in the rubble screaming in agony. By September, 90% of the city's 200,000 residents were dead or missing, leaving only skeletal remains of the Genbaku Dome and shadowed figures etched into the walls of the Hiroshima Prefectural Industrial Promotional Hall. 3 days later, on August 9th, the world watched as the Bockscar bomber, piloted by 24-year-old Major Charles Sweeney, dropped Fat Man on Nagasaki. Planned for Kokura, the primary target, the mission had nearly failed due to smoke from industrial fires obscuring the city. A last-minute redirection saved the team from flying to Hiroshima, a possibility few found acceptable. Unlike Hiroshima, Nagasaki's hilly terrain and rivers amplified the bomb's effects, creating a crater 500 feet wide and 90 feet deep. The death toll reached 150,000 by year's end, with many victims suffering from leukemia and radiation sickness long after. The psychological endurance of the survivors, later called hibakusha, would haunt generations as they contended with cancer and societal stigma. Japan's cabinet convened in an impromptu now void of leaders. The military had lost 40% of its aircraft, its factories were crippled, and the Soviet Union had invaded Manchuria on August 8th, breaching the neutrality pact they had held since 1936. Emperor Hirohito recorded an unprecedented radio address on August 15th, announcing Japan's surrender. The conditions of surrender allowed Hirohito to remain emperor, a concession the U.S. had secretly negotiated with Japanese leaders in July. The authority of the emperor, Truman declared in a press release, will be subject to the same limitations as outlined in the Potsdam Declaration. The aftermath of the bombings exposed the human cost of nuclear warfare. In Tokyo, doctors treated atomic bomb diseases in victims whose bodies had liquefied, their flesh burned away by nuclear radiation. Hospitals overflowed with patients missing limbs or suffering from radiation-induced hemorrhages. Survivors fled to rural areas, but their testimonies were dismissed by some as propaganda. It took decades for the world to grasp the full toll. By 1950, over 200,000 had died, and tens of thousands more bore lifelong injuries. The Manhattan Project's success had reshaped geopolitics overnight. Stalin, furious at the U.S.'s sole monopoly on nuclear weapons, immediately accelerated the Soviet program. By 1949, the USSR detonated its first atomic bomb, code-named First Lightning, at the Semipalatinsk test site, a shadow of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that would eventually dwarf them in scale. Back in Los Alamos, Oppenheimer watched the Japanese surrender announcement with a mixture of relief and guilt. His security clearance was revoked in 1954, and he later lamented the U.S.'s moral failure in using the bomb. General Groves, meanwhile, retreated from public life, avoiding acknowledgement of the survivors' suffering. The U.S. nuclear arsenal grew in the Cold War, and the dream of ending war through deterrence collided with the reality of mutually assured destruction. Yet in 1945, the bomb had ended the longest and bloodiest war in human history. The Manhattan Project's legacy remains contentious. It saved millions of lives by averting an invasion of Japan, yet it unleashed a technological terror that still looms over humanity. In the shadow of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the question persists. How does a democratic nation reconcile the moral imperative to end suffering with the unspeakable destruction wrought by its creations? The answer would shape the 20th century and beyond. The quest for uranium led physicists to remote corners of the globe, where raw materials lay hidden beneath decades of cosmic erosion. In 1941, a 30-ton shipment of pitchblende ore, mined from the clay-rich deserts of Shaba, Belgian Congo, arrived at the U.S. Metallurgical Laboratory in Chicago. The shipment was secured by Corporal George Cavall, a young soldier transferred to the Manhattan Project under suspicious circumstances. His later defect to the Soviet Union in 1945 would expose part of the uranium cache's trajectory. But for now, the material was smashed, dissolved, and refined into yellowcake, the first step toward weapons-grade uranium-235. The material's journey was perilous. Lid-lined containers, escorted by armed convoy, traversed 7,000 miles of Nazi-occupied Europe, where SS agents sought intercepts. Dr. Lise Meitner, a Jewish physicist exiled from Nazi Germany, later recalled the race between Allied and Axis chemists to isolate the fissile isotope, a contest more tense than a duel at high noon. Meanwhile, in the labyrinthine tunnels of the Hanford site, where the Columbia River's spring floods occasionally breached levees, physicist Enrico Fermi's team constructed the world's first sustained nuclear reactor, Chicago Pile 1. The reactor's success hinged on an unglamorous material, graphite, mined from Pennsylvania's vast Godwin Creek mine. Thousands of miners, armed with pickaxes and dynamite, worked shift after shift to excavate 5,000 tons of graphite, a material critical for slowing neutrons to sustain a chain reaction. The graphite was then carved into 350,000 blocks at Chicago's construction yards, each the size of a small coffin, and transported by rail to Hanford. Beneath a dike-topped bunker 300 feet underground, uranium rods cooled by liquid sodium eventually achieved a critical reaction on December 2, 1942. The event marked the dawn of the atomic age, though few present could foresee its destructive potential. Meanwhile, the enrichment of uranium-235 depended on electromagnetic separation at Oak Ridge's Y-12 plant, a sprawling campus nestled in the East Tennessee mountains. Workers, mostly young women recruited from nearby Knoxville, dressed in electrochemical suits and gloves to manually assemble calutrons, massive magnets that separated uranium isotopes by charge. The labor began in 1943, and by 1944, 281 calutrons were operating around the clock. Their efforts doubled the output of pure uranium-235 every 6 weeks, enough to fuel a single bomb. At Los Alamos, Ida Noddack-Teller, the physicist who proposed the very term nuclear fission in 1934, spelled out calculations for the critical mass of enriched uranium while her husband, Otto Hahn, quietly accepted the Nobel Prize in Berlin, a stark reminder of Germany's fading ambitions. Plutonium production, however, required a different alchemy. Reactors at the Hanford site, built in the shadow of gargantuan containment domes, bombarded uranium with neutrons until they transmuted into fissile plutonium-239. The first reactor, B Queen, went critical on September 5, 1944, but its cooling system failed catastrophically during a test in November, flooding the site with radioactive coolant. Workers scrambled to contain the leak, their Geiger counters registering alarming surges. Later, a second reactor, B Twin, became operational, supplying material for experimental bombs. At Los Alamos, Enrico Fermi designed a mock-up of the plutonium bomb in a squash court beneath the Fuller Lodge, using wooden boxes to simulate the implosion mechanism. Mathematician Richard Feynman, tasked with securing materials, discovered that local ranchers had illegally stocked sheep with reactor isotopes, which posed new risks to the project's secrecy. The bombs themselves followed distinct paths to completion. The uranium gun-type device, Little Boy, required a crude mechanism but functioned with relative simplicity. 2 subcritical masses of uranium-235 would be fired into one another via rails, achieving criticality mid-air. The plutonium implosion design, Fat Man, posed a greater challenge. To compress a sphere of fissile material into a supercritical state, scientists at Los Alamos and the Metallurgical Laboratory developed a pneumatic system using stainless steel cylinders and high explosives. The device's precision demanded synchronization to 100 billionths of a second, achieved with differential diodes calibrated to lunar tides. By July 1945, 3 bombs existed, 2 uranium and 1 plutonium. The first test of the plutonium device, Trinity, occurred at 5:30 a.m. on July 16, 1945, in New Mexico's Alamogordo bombing and gunnery range. The desert landscape shook, and the air thickened with tritium, the Johnny Macaroo inscribed on early fusion research. A single spruce tree survived the blast, now known as the Living Trinity, its rings tracing the shockwave's propagation. It smelled like elemental sulfur, recalled technician Harry Potter, like butter burnt in a fireplace. That morning, J. Robert Oppenheimer quoted the Bhagavad Gita to his colleagues, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The final assembly of the bombs occurred under bone-crushing secrecy at the Pantex plant in Texas, where over 5,000 workers slept in temporary barracks. Fat Man's plutonium core, weighed meticulously in an underground vault, was wedged into a metal casing no larger than a can of tuna. Each bomb was shrink-wrapped in heavy plastic coated with lead foil, then crated alongside conventional munitions. The Enola Gay's payload arrived at Hawaii's North Field 8 days before its August 6 deployment, where Colonel Paul Tibbets, a judge advocate by trade, received strict orders to maintain no radio contact with the B-29. Meanwhile, Charles Sweeney, pilot of the Boxcar, practiced low-level overcast bombing runs over the Tibbets complex in New Mexico, a structure built to mimic Japanese cityscapes. In Japan, the decision to surrender hinged on realism. On July 25, 1945, U.S. bombers conducted test runs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, using radar decoys to mask the true targets. The Japanese military dismissed the Enola Gay's reconnaissance flights as routine, unaware the city's proximity to the Hiroshima Marine Base and its fuel reserves made it a pivotal objective. When the bomb detonated at 8:16 a.m., John Hersey's later account in Hiroshima would immortalize the instant. Some soldiers ran screaming, knocking over a row of wounded patients in a hospital corridor. 3 days later, Fat Man annihilated Nagasaki's Mitsubishi Arms Factory, a producer of torpedoes and aircraft engines. The blast vaporized 84 kilotons of ordnance, though the target's original aim was Kokura, a city shrouded by low clouds. As the Boxcar circled for a second pass, its nuclear sights trained on Kokura's shipyards, the city vanished below the horizon. Boxcar diverted to Nagasaki, striking it instead. The bomb's diplomatic weight was undeniable. At the Potsdam Conference in July, Truman's ultimatum, unconditional surrender or annihilation, met with stubborn resistance. Japanese leaders debated evacuating civilians to sparsely populated Hokkaido, but their ingrained belief in Kyotan progress through virtue clashed with the unthinkable destruction now materializing. On August 8, Soviet forces invaded Manchuria, seizing Port Arthur and dismantling the Kwantung Army in 19 days, a betrayal that accelerated Japan's collapse. 2 days later, at Truman's behest, the bombs fell. The aftermath unfolded in monochrome. Survivors, or hibakusha, wandered through ghost cities where shadows of the dead lingered on sidewalks. In Kokura, a daycare worker named Koko Tanimoto muttered prayers while cradling a child whose arm had melted into a charred stripe of flesh. At the Trinity site, U.S. scientists tested radioactive fallout levels, noting calcium-48 accumulation in cattle milk, a grim preview of Cold War contamination crises. President Truman, reading casualty estimates from Operation Downfall, the projected invasion of Japan, in his desk, framed the bombs as a miracle of technology that saved millions of lives. But dissent simmered. Physicists Leo Szilard and Joseph E. Kerr petitioned the War Department to warn civilians, arguing that this miracle could be cried over. Meanwhile, Oppenheimer initiated the Fulbright Committee to study benign nuclear applications, only to see his vision stifled by the Atomic Energy Commission's militarization. By 1946, the Manhattan Project had devoured $23 billion equivalent to $280 billion today and employed 200,000 workers. Waste materials littered the Arizona desert and the distant shore of the Pacific's Marshall Islands, where the U.S. amassed cobalt-60 waste from reactors to dump on enemy beaches. Plutonium pits, polished to perfection at Pantex, were stored in wooden vaults at Willow Grove, Pennsylvania, under the watchful eye of General Thomas Farrell, who enforced a policy where scientists knew enough to be useful but not enough to be dangerous. The bomb's legacy bifurcated in the post-war world. In the U.S., the Atomic Energy Act of 1946 created civilian oversight, yet the military retained veto power over weapon designs. The Rosebrook system at Sandia Laboratories began declassifying physics manuals, while children's toys like the Atomic Winnebago board game trivialized destruction. In the USSR, scientists like Igor Kurchatov doubled down, testing a plutonium bomb in 1949 at Semipalatinsk using a portable assembly method dubbed the bomb in a box. Today, the remnants of Hiroshima's atomic bomb dome stand as UNESCO heritage, a charred relic with a skeletal frame, its dome roof melted into a cratered shell. Service bells salvaged from the bomb's epicenter rang at midnight on August 5, 1995, a haunting testament to precision destroyed. The Manhattan Project's epilogue continues at the National Museum of Nuclear Science and History in Albuquerque, where visitors trace Geiger counters once hidden from the public and ponder how a race to avoid annihilation birthed technologies still threatening millennia-long survival.